Okay, so far we've had a look at the early settlers, we've looked at the Indian way of life, we've looked at the trailblazers, the mountain men, the Mormons and the gold miners. Then we moved on to have a look at the second part of this topic. It's divided into three. The first part are the early settlers. The second part is all about conflict emerging on the plains, and that's what we're on to at the moment. The last few sessions we focused on the Civil War. Whilst the Civil War was going on, the Indian problem was also going on in the background. The government's attention was definitely focused on the Civil War, but as soon as the Civil War was over, the government could refocus their attention on the Indian problem, get rid of the Indians, thus helping to achieve Manifest Destiny. Excellent. So we're going to the story now. And it does involve backtracking a little bit, and in fact backtracking a lot, because we're going to go back to the very beginnings in 1834. Now, my group, you had one of these sheets, and we filled it out as we went along. I'm not so sure Mrs. Green uses this. No, I quite like it because it kind of lays everything out on one page, but it's definitely not as detailed as you want. So the first starting point is in 1834, and it's the permanent Indian frontier. Now, can you remember, I'll zoom in on this, can you remember what the permanent Indian frontier actually was? Ethan?
Wasn't it the land west of the Mississippi River was supposed to be meant to belong to things Indian?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I keep moving this because I'm trying to get it right on my computer so that people who watch this can actually see what we're talking about. But you're absolutely right. The permanent Indian frontier was something that was drawn, it's basically an imaginary line drawn down America, and it was done by President Jackson because as early as 1834, down there, the Indians had already been labelled as a problem. Okay, this was before there was even much migration west. They already realised that the Indians were a bit of a problem, and we needed to come up with a solution for the problem. And the solution was this line. The whites were going to take all of the land east of this line, all of the good land, the land that was worth something. And it's not like the whites were being kind when they gave the Indians all of the land to the west of this line. What did they actually call this land? They thought it was worthless. Sorry? The Great American Desert. Well done. Because the whites felt that this land was worthless. So let the Indians have it. Push the Indians onto the plains. They can have the Great American Desert, which is a huge area of land. It really is. It's not small at all. And there was to be no white people who would break here. Or at least that was the promise. Do you think if white people kept that promise and they didn't start to move west, the Indians and the whites could have lived side by side? Yeah, I totally think so, absolutely. This area of land given to me, given, it's awful, doesn't it? Because it wasn't given to them, it was their land at the very beginning. But either way, the land given to the Indians, the Great American Desert, it was huge. And it could definitely have supported the tribes of the plains as long as the whites keep their promise and they do not move west. Do the whites keep their promise?
No.
Absolutely not. So it's well worth knowing the permanent Indian frontier was the first attempt to deal with the Indian problem. It was an imaginary line. It was drawn by President Jackson. Now, Mrs. Green's group, do not get too fixated if we are going over some stuff that you haven't heard, because vice versa, my group, I've given them the quiz booklets, and Mrs. Green, and there's some questions in there that I don't focus on. So it's not the end of the world, but the permanent Indian frontier you definitely should have heard of. It's this imaginary line that divides America, everything to the west, the Great American Desert, give it to the Indians, everything to the east, the whites are going to take, because that's the land that was worth something. Now, you've already said that people did not keep that promise. So what groups of people started to break the permanent Indian frontier? Tom? Excellent, yes. So mountain men, gold miners, Mormons, the early settlers start to ignore this promise, this imaginary line, because they realise that the West has huge amounts of wealth. The Great American Desert has huge amounts of wealth. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about why these guys go west. You kind of know, don't you? Mountain men, beavers, skins, gold miners, obvious, gold. Mormons, religious freedom, But in doing so, moving west, they helped to develop the land. The Mormons developed the land, the gold miners developed the land. Can anybody remember one of the mining camps that developed into a town that later developed into a city, which is still there, San Francisco? With these come problems, and I've written some of the problems there: guns, death, disease, use of resources like water, grass, timber. The white people, they destroyed it. They didn't destroy it, but they harvested literally every tree they could. They needed wood. And as a result, there wasn't much wood on the plains, and the little wood that was there was just devoured by the white people, as were the grass. They blazed trails which paved the way for other people to follow as well. So this really did disrupt the Indian way of life. It caused problems. And there looked like there was going to be a war between the Indian nations, the white settlers, and the white government. What treaty stopped that war? I know you know. Kai? Yeah, say it, Kai. Fort Laramie. Yeah, well done. The first treaty of Fort Laramie stopped this potential war because the Indians, understandably, start attacking the settlers, the Mormons, the gold miners, the mountain men. Not only Indians, but lots of the different tribes now see these migrants as hostile, and as such, they start attacking them. So it looks like there's going to be an all-out war between the Indian nations and the white government until we get the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I'm going to move this one, is that right?
Yeah.
Yep. Can you remember, before I put it under, can you remember what the treaty, I don't want the specifics, but can you remember what the Treaty of Fort Laramie actually did, what it said? Ross?
Didn't they gather most of the tribe leaders and arrange terms with them, but then it was a problem because their tribe mates didn't actually have to find
yeah, good. I wouldn't say all of them. Lots of the different tribes met with the white government and they thrashed out peace terms. And that was problematic, and that links back to the Indian way of life because we've already mentioned it, but chiefs couldn't necessarily speak for all of the Native Americans within his tribe. He wasn't a dictator. He could say, right, this is how we're going. He was an elder, he could advise. So many of the chiefs that made peace at Fort Laramie, they took those peace deals back to their tribes, and they weren't all accepting of that. Go on.
Is this the one with the reservation?
We're moving towards reservations, okay? This is kind of the first mention of it, of the Indians staying in certain areas agreed upon by the government and not just the tribal groups themselves.
Did the Laramie Treaty start trading between the plains Indians and the white Americans?
That was one of the things it did. It did lots of things, and I've highlighted some of what I consider some of the main kind of sticking points on here. You've got this in your exercise book, my group. You probably haven't because you joined late, but I can give you all of these if you think they're worthwhile. Mrs. Green's group as well. I can give you all of this stuff. You just have to hassle me for it. You have to pop on up, shoot the time, or not shoot the time because I'm on the other side of the school, but at some point, and say, sir, can we photocopy those sheets? So you don't really need this bit at the top, but it's extra knowledge nonetheless. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was arranged by a trapper named Thomas Fitzpatrick. He arranged for the Indian chiefs representatives to meet with representatives of the white government, and they thrashed out a deal. Now, there were lots and lots of different articles to the Treaty of Fort Laramie, but some of the more important ones I've highlighted on this sheet because both sides were making brilliant promises. Okay, it looks like there's going to be a war. Both sides meet, and both sides make brilliant promises to each other, and it stops the war. What is the problem with these promises? Do you remember?
The white Americans break them.
Yes, the white Americans aren't going to keep them, but some of the Indian promises are also not to be kept.
Is it the money?
This isn't money, this is all about promises. Both sides are making brilliant promises that they simply are not going to stick to. You are right in the sense that the white Americans double-crossed the Indians time and time, but at the you're going to see in it, were making promises that actually the tribe were probably not going to agree to, and that's what you highlighted earlier, Ross.
Are they like farming and not killing travelers?
Yes, that was one of the points, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the first one, let me zoom in. You don't need to write all this down, what are the main ones? If I was going to tell you to write anything down, I would tell you to write, like, Article 1 is a promise by the Indians, and they're promising to agree in the future to maintain good faith, friendship, and make an effective, lasting peace. Well, that's a good promise, isn't it? It's going to stop a war. And then the Indians go on and they kind of take this to the next level, and this is one that I think is going to be broken. The Indian nations do hereby recognize the right of the United States government to establish roads, military, and other outposts or other posts within their territories. Now, it's all very well the Indians agreeing to that at Fort Laramie, but 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line, do you think the Indians are going to want to stick to this? To allow white people onto their territories to build roads and military outposts? No. I think this is an example of the Indians making a promise that they're probably not going to keep, just like the whites did. So if I was going to write one down, I'd definitely write down that one as an example of a promise being made at Fort Laramie that probably wasn't going to be kept. This one down here is all to do with territories. And Dom, you mentioned, I think it was you mentioned a minute ago, is Fort Laramie to do with reservations. Although the word is not being used within this treaty, this is very much the idea of a reservation system. This is the Indians agreeing with the whites to stay on, certain tracts of land. Now, you might argue that the Indians were already doing this because they were tribal areas. One in one area, one tribe lived in another, and so on. But this took it to the next level in the sense that this is the Indians agreeing with the whites that this tribe will stay here, and this tribe will stay there, and that tribe will stay there. And that's exactly what the whites wanted to do. They wanted to ensure that the Indians stayed to their tracts of land, so any spare land, any of the land opened up was accessible to the white settlers. Once again, I wouldn't go into lots of detail about writing out where these borders lie, where these territories lie, because I don't remember this. I just know that Article 5 focused on the Indians staying in certain areas, and this was very much the beginnings of a reservation system. Article 3. What the United States are promising. The United States bind themselves to protect the Indian nation against all deprivation by the people of the United States. So basically, the government is promising to protect the Indians from the white settlers, absolutely. Bearing in mind the government wants to achieve manifest destiny, do you think they're ever likely to keep this promise? No, probably not. And that is the problem with this treaty. This treaty is excellent, and it did stop a war. It meant that both sides were kind of happy and went back to their respective areas and tried to live side by side. But when you actually read between the lines and you look at some of these promises, I don't think this treaty was going to last very long because of the nature of what people were promising to do. They're not going to keep these promises. So that is the first treaty of Fort Laramie. And Kai, why is it likely not to keep peace? Absolutely. Both sides are probably going to break the promises that were made at Fort Laramie. Some of them are keener to break them than others. The government, for example. Next handout. This is all in your book. It's glued in your book as a story. Read it. Make sure you're going over it. Because this came up on your exam. Your exam asked you about which was the more important factor for the settlement of the West, the homesteaders or the defeat of the Plains Indians. Something along the lines, wasn't that?
Yeah.
Excuse me. And if you're talking about the defeat of the Plains Indians, this is a specific detail. Maybe I wouldn't write about this quite yet. I'd probably pick the story up from Little Crow's War and Black Kettle's War and Red Cloud's War and the Battle of Little Bighorn and the consequences of the Battle of Little Bighorn. You remember the Dawes Act, the Dawes General Allotment Act that divided up Indian reservations into 160-acre plots? They banned the Sundance, didn't they? They undermined the power of the chief. What did they do with little Indian children? Yeah, so you sent them off to white boarding schools so they forgot their culture, their So we get the top marks on that question. Okay, that's why you're reviewing, and that's why you're here. You are revising. It's good. Okay, so Fort Laramie. This is some of the reasons why the treaty broke down. And in fact, you don't need any more than what we've already spoken about. We've mentioned the fact that no Indian chief could speak for all of his people. So they're making promises at Fort Laramie. They take those promises back to their tribe. And there are some elders within the tribe that absolutely despise the chief for making these promises. They feel like they're selling out. Both sides aren't likely to keep their promise either. That's another reason why this broke down. And lastly, could the government actually control the settlers once they'd opened the floodgates? Absolutely not. It's not like you could have stopped the settlers going west. Because why are they going west? They're not going west to achieve manifest destiny. They're going west to achieve a better life. Exactly, that's what I was going to say. And when people want to achieve a better life, they will go to the ends of the earth. Look at the refugee crisis we have at the moment. I watched something on the news yesterday of a group of refugees in France that basically set up camp in the middle of the town as a protest to say, look, we've got no home. You're keeping us here like animals. And the police went in, and it was all filmed. There was imagery of the police like kicking in the tent, like tipping up and people out. Like they're not even human beings. And you think how far they've come for a better life. So once the government had kind of opened up the gates to potential settlement of the West, they were never going to be able to close them again because people wanted a better life, and they would have stopped at nothing to achieve a better life. And as a result, the Treaty of Fort Laramie broke down. Now, this is just an interesting story, and you do not need to write this, but my group, you remember the Lane Cow incident? Yeah? Because this is the first time that the Indians, since the Treaty of Fort Laramie, this is the first time that the Indians and the whites have a bit of conflict. And it's all to do with a lame cow that had been left behind to die by its white owner. An Indian took it. The Indian was called High Forehead, and he took the cow because it had been left behind to die. On hearing that an Indian had taken the cow, the white owner wanted money. He wanted paying for it because how dare that Indian take what was mine? And he approached the army to help him, and a hot-headed young Lieutenant Grattan took up the opportunity, and he took the army, or at least a group of soldiers, to Kicking Bear's camp, and he demanded that Kicking Bear hand over High Forehead, because High Forehead is a thief, and he must be punished because he's an Indian. Kicking Bear, the chief, says, no, I'm not going to hand him over to you because you're going to kill him. What I will do is I will give you 2 cows to replace the one which High Forehead took. That should have been enough, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't. An argument broke out and the soldiers killed Kicking Bear, the chief. And understandably, the Indians swarmed upon the remaining soldiers and killed every single one of them. Who comes across as the bad guys? The Indians, absolutely, even though they were just defending what was kind of theirs. So the Treaty of Fort Laramie did not last long. It was written in 1851, and by, when did this happen? 54? Yeah, by 1854, the Indians and the whites were fighting again. And this leads us directly on to Little Crow's War. Little Crow's War. I'm going to put that under in a minute. I'm just going to put this up just so the people that look at this at home, they can pause it, they can read it at their leisure, and I'll just stop touching it. So Little Crow, Little Crow, Little Crow. Now, again, my group, you have these in your book, okay? You have this double-page spread with the 4 Indian wars on it. You've got Little Crow's War, you've got Black Kettle's War and the Sand Creek Massacre, you've got the bit that happened after Sand Creek, you've got Red Cloud's War, you've got the winter campaigns and the destruction of a buffalo, and a little bit there about the humanitarians and the exterminators, because that's kind of the 2 different groups of people at the end of the wars. You either wanted to exterminate the Indians, or you just wanted to kind of force the Indians onto reservations. but we'll talk about that now as we go. So have a look in your exercise book. You've also got, if you're using this big A3 overview that we looked at the very beginning, you've got summaries of the Indian Wars there. You've got this top bit about the permanent Indian frontier. You've got this bit here about the problems that the early settlers caused and how there was nearly a war. You've got this summary here about the Treaty of Fort Laramie and why it broke down. And then you've got these really quick summaries of the Indian Wars. For some people who have predicted level 3s, there are some people that have missed so much obvious stuff in their exam that they dropped down to like level 1 and level 2 because they just weren't writing about what they knew, just a few key facts about some of the key points. So use this, dig it out of your exercise book, stick it on a wall, I don't know, revise it. So let's zoom in on Little Crow's War. Can you remember, without reading it, why is that gone so blurry on my screen? That's better. So, Little Crow's War, without reading it, try not to read it. What was it over? Starvation on the? No, reservations, that's it. Black Kettle's War, starvation on the? Reservations. Red Cloud's War? No. Well, yeah, what did they find on the reservation? Gold. Good, so you know the causes, basically. You just need to know a little bit of detail that goes with each of them. So, Little Crow had voluntarily moved onto a reservation. But because of the nature of reservations, he had to plant crops to survive. And those crops had failed. The supplies that had been promised to Little Crow by the government did not arrive. And his people faced starvation. They were dying. The governor was even quoted as saying, if they're hungry, let them eat grass. Now, if you're the leader of a tribe and your people that you care about so very much are starving to death before your eyes, and you've got a governor of the area that you live in, a white governor of the area you live in, saying, well, if they're hungry, let them eat grass, what's going to be your response?
Personally, I poison myself.
So violence.
Yeah.
You want to kill him because he does not care. He's shown a complete and utter disregard for you, your people, babies, mothers, the elderly. So you can understand why Little Crow and his people were somewhat knocked off. The polite way of putting it. Now, Little Crow wanted and had tried to keep to the terms of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, but when he sees 12,000 of his people starving, he is left with no choice. And he leads his people off the reservation and he attacks white settlers, homesteads, governments, killing whites, taking where possible. He's angry. You can understand why there was violence during this period. There were horrible reports. We watched a video about this, and do you remember some of the reports were about Indians nailing children alive to trees? Now, are the white settlers and the white government going to read a balanced argument about this event? Are they going to read an Indian account of it? No, they're only going to read what appears in the white newspapers. So as a white settler who already fears the Indians, when you're reading that they are rampaging across the plains, killing whites, nailing children alive to trees, are you going to have any sympathy for the Indians? No, and that's the big issue with the Indian Wars. It evaporates any sympathy that any white person might have for the Indians. And this is just the beginnings. Sympathy for the Indians starts to evaporate, starts to disappear because of these wars. It takes 3 months for the army to sort out the insurrection. And a number of the Sioux, Little Crow's people, are arrested and executed as a warning what will happen to you, to other Indians, if you do not follow the government, the laws of the government of the United States. I wouldn't be trying to write all of this out. I definitely tried to be doing it in little short, snappy bullet points like Little Crow Sioux moved on to reservation, crops failed, supplies to arrive, 12 led them off onto the warpath, and he killed lots of people. That's not a problem because I kind of understand why he did it, but it didn't do his cause any favors because it just cemented that attitude that actually the Indians were wild savages that did need to be conquered for the safety of every white settler. Can I move off of this? Yeah, okay. So we're going to move up now to the Cheyenne uprising. Different tribe now, the Cheyenne, and led by Black Kettle. And this is the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre happens because of the Cheyenne uprising. Do you remember Sand Creek? Yeah. What a hideous, hideous massacre. Talk about it in a second. Okay, so just like Little Crow, Black Kettle had agreed to move his tribe onto a reservation. He quickly realized he'd been sold a lie. The land was useless, and the buffalo quickly ran out, that they could not hunt buffalo in the sufficient numbers to sustain their tribe. And faced with starvation, just like the Sioux, Black Kettle was left with no other option but to lead his people off the reservation and steal food to stop himself from starving. What is the big difference between what Black Kettle did and what Little Crow did, Kai?
Black Kettle
Didn't kill a single person. He held people up, held people hostage, and he took food. He raided government supply stores. He stole cattle, but nobody was killed. And that's the important bit, because what happened after was a horrific event for a group of people that weren't actually hurting anybody and they were just keeping themselves from starving. So Colonel Shivington was put in charge of dealing with the Black Kettle problem. Black Kettle actually, because Shivington hounded the Cheyenne, every time they settled, Shivington was on their tail, forcing them to move on, and he was killing Cheyenne wherever he found them. Faced with such kind of odds, Black Kettle rode into one of the army camps with a big white flag saying he wanted peace. Was he allowed peace? No, that was when he was ordered back to Sand Creek. Peace was the last thing that the Governor Evans wanted with the Indians at this stage. So the Indians were forced back to Sand Creek, small part of the reservation. And the following day, Shivington and his men massacred the tribe. Now, I've got some stats for this that isn't on this sheet. They killed 28 men and 105 women and children. What does that tell you about this attack? There, cowardly. Was this aimed at destroying the Indians, or? That's a good, yeah, I don't think that was their intention at the very beginning. Otherwise, that would have been very smart. I see what you're saying. It was to hammer home a message, wasn't there? Such a horrific massacre on women and children. That's not going to help you conquer the Indians because the men are still around to fight. But it's sending home a message. So Shivington and his soldiers, they rode in at dawn. Even though Black Kettle had an American flag flying high in the village to show that he supported the American government, he'd actually gone back onto a reservation. He was no longer off the reservation stealing food. And Shivington, with the full support of the governor of Colorado, rode into Black Kettle's camp, shooting and killing and massacring at will. There were some horrific stories that came out of this massacre. Women who presented themselves as women and they were still brutalized. There was a captain involved in this. I think his name is Silas Sue. 1 second, just let me find it. And he wrote after this massacre, he couldn't take part. What he saw sickened him, and he couldn't take part in it. And he goes on then to write, 1 second. Oh, here it is, sorry. He says, it looked too hard for me to see children on their knees begging for their lives, having their brains beaten out like dogs. So this was a horrific massacre. What they did to the dead women was also shocking. My group, we watched a video where it explained, I'm not so sure about the screens, but there were instances of the soldiers cutting out the private parts of women and stretching them across their hats and their saddle bows. Now, something like that is unbelievably hard to even imagine. But the important thing about that event is that the soldiers, although disciplined to a certain degree, Shivington especially, Shivington kind of shouldered the blame for it, but there were women, white women in Denver, Colorado, white settlers where the Sand Creek Massacre took place, who fully supported the government in their actions at Sand Creek. Now, you might imagine that women might kind of show solidarity with other women and think, well, look at these horrible men who brutalized these poor Indian women. But they didn't. Because they've been so brainwashed about how wild and savage the Indians were and how they must be conquered, that just normal, everyday people, godly people, religious people, support like this because it means Indians were slowly being conquered.
Even if I was away in America at that point, supported the government, I would just sound like repulsive because it was unnecessary.
Exactly, it's just a sickening, barbaric act. In the word repulsive, absolutely, I share that sentiment. And they were already dead. This was after they died. They cut, yeah, we're not going to go back there, but yeah, they mutilated the bodies. It's hard to believe. But what is even more shocking in some ways is that the white women of Denver, Colorado supported this action. Maybe not this specific action, but they supported the soldiers in what they did towards Black Kettle and his people. Now, understandably, the Indians were annoyed, and the Cheyenne went on the warpath, and other tribes joined them. And the war went on for about 4 years, was it? Yeah, from 64 through to 1868. The Cheyenne were on the warpath, and the government spent over 30 million trying to deal with the Indian problem. Now, whilst the Indians are on the warpath, what are they doing to their reputation with white people? Destroying it, absolutely. It's not like the but now they're on the they might kill me, they might kill my family. So it just means that the settlers, the white settlers, are more willing to support a harsher attitude upon the Indians from the government. Do we blame the Indians for going on the warpath?
No.
Absolutely not. But did the white settlers even really take the time to understand why the Indians were on the warpath? No, they just knew the Indians were on the warpath. I'm scared. The Indians must be conquered. Ethan. No, not that I know of. It's just the war which followed. I suppose you could call it the consequences of Sand Creek. It might have a specific name, but I haven't come across it yet, so they stand to be corrected there. And what followed, and this is all top level stuff. If you remember this, you're going to ace the exam. Finally, they worked to agree peace at a place called Medicine Lodge. And what smaller reservations, almost as a punishment to the Cheyenne for daring to go on the warpath because they were so brutalized at Sand Creek. In Medicine Lodge, where they agreed peace terms, one chief refused to give in. He refused to move onto the reservations that the government wanted, and he wanted to keep his territory. And his name was Red Cloud. And we're going to move on to his war in a second. Once we're done with Red Cloud, we're done. So it might overrun by about 5 minutes. If any of you need to leave at 4, by all means, feel free to go. But it makes sense that we try to get through all of this in this one session. So I'm going to continue. Can I move on to Red Cloud now? Yeah. Okay. Once again, my group, you've got this in your books, and Mrs. Green's group, I will definitely photocopy. I think they're quite handy, to tell you the truth. It kind of summarises everything on one A4 page. So, Red Cloud's war was slightly different because it was not over starvation on the reservation, because Red Cloud basically refused to move on to them. He was maintaining his old hunting grounds and his old territories. But unbeknown to Red Cloud, gold was found in his territory. Is the government going to be able to stop the settlers ploughing into Red Cloud's land?
No.
Absolutely not. Definitely not. So gold was found, and as a result, a new trail, the Bozeman Trail, was set up, and it led right in to Red Cloud's hunting grounds, okay, some of his most important land. And as a result, thousands and thousands of settlers followed the Bozeman Trail to try to get the gold. You can understand why Red Cloud was somewhat annoyed. Understandably, Red Cloud attacks the travellers on the trail. So the government sends in the army to build forts all along the trail to protect the travellers. And this is where Red Cloud kind of sticks it to the American government. Unfortunately, his victory is not long lasting. So Red Cloud is attacking the miners who are traveling the Bozeman Trail. The government sends in the army to build forts all along the trail to protect the travelers. And Red Cloud ambushes one of the army groups, led by a captain. It's not on here. Captain Fetterman. Fetterman has 100 men with him. And Red Cloud ambushes Fetterman and kills every single one. Big victory for the Indians, right? Yeah, they burn down all the forts, they celebrate, but unfortunately, it's not long lasting. And Red Cloud realizes he cannot stand up to fight the full force of the American army. So when the American army come crashing down on Red Cloud and say, look, now is the time, you have to agree peace deal. You have to move on to a reservation, and if you don't do it now, we will send in the army and we will destroy you. So Red Cloud was left with very few options, but to agree to peace and the creation of the Great Sioux Reservation. That is important because that is what the Battle of the Little Bighorn is fought over. The Black Hills are in the Great Sioux Reservation. The Outland, sorry, I did forget, this is the second Fort Laramie Treaty. The first one was in 51. Now in 1868, the second treaty at Fort Laramie, where Red Cloud agrees peace and to move his followers onto the Great Sioux Reservation. That came with a promise that no white man would ever set foot onto that reservation. So Red Cloud was somewhat happy. We now know that that's just one blatant lie. But to Red Cloud, that seemed like a future for his people. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, though, they refuse to go. And they become a thorn in the government side later on, Battle of Little Bighorn. After each of these wars, any sympathy that white settlers might have for the Indians starts to evaporate, because the Indians are always portrayed as the bad guys. The white settlers don't get a balanced argument. It's not like they're presented with the Indians' view of the events from like an Indian newspaper. That didn't exist. So all of their information was being given to them by the US government, by white people, propaganda, encouraging you to hate the Indians. I'm nearly done, okay? About 2 more minutes. So the government also, from 1868 onwards, started to kill off the buffalo as a way of trying to destroy the Indian way of life. And they also embarked on something that became known as the winter campaigns. Did the Indians fight during the winter months? No, they weren't even really that nomadic during the winter months. Some moved more than others, but they often stayed in one spot a lot longer during the winter months. And the government knew this. So the government sent out bands of army volunteers, but also soldiers, to hunt down the Indians during the winter months. And when you caught up with one, you'd kill them. So the Indians are always being forced to move camp. The army is coming, let's move again. The army is coming, let's move again. Soon, starvation starts to set in, disease starts to set in, And the Indians, they've been hounded for so long, not just through the winter campaigns, but in the build-up to this, that many tribes simply say, enough is enough. They go into the army camps with their white flags and they say, we will agree to your peace terms. We will move on to your reservations. And that was the winter campaign, to hound the Indians throughout the winter months, forcing them to keep moving. Starvation sets in, disease sets in, and you're basically breaking them. If you're a leader and you see all of the people that you care about the most in the world around you suffering, what options do you have? You've tried fighting back, you're massacred. You must try to work with the whites, and that's the impact which the winter campaign had. And the very last bit are the two different groups that emerged after the Indian Wars. You were either part of the humanitarian group, and they weren't really humanitarians. They believed that the Indians should be forced onto reservations. The president at the time, President Grant, was a part of the humanitarians. And one of the ways of achieving this was the destruction of the buffalo. So there are different estimates in different textbooks, but one estimate says that in 1850, there were around 60 million buffalo on the plains. And by 1910, there are only 85 left. What a tragedy, eh? Just to force the Indians onto reservations, we're going to wipe out an entire species. No, but there are no wild herds of buffalo on the plains today. There are buffalo on the plains. Buffalo are farmed on the plains by homesteaders, surprisingly, that have huge areas of land because it was given to them by the US government. There has been talk for a long time of reintroducing wild buffalo herds to the plains, but they're a really dangerous animal, so you need to make sure they are not near any kind of civilization. It's like we are talking about introducing wolves back into the environment up in the Highlands of Scotland. There are plenty of farmers up there and landowners that say, no, that's really a bad idea, but lots of tree-hugging like humanitarians that say, yes, let's bring back wolves. I don't know where I stand on that. So lastly, and you had the hardliners. The hardliners are sometimes known as the exterminators because they want to exterminate the Indians. They want to wipe them out. And this group was very much made up of the army. And just last bit down there, as a result of the Indian Wars, the hardliners began to get their way. There were more people willing to support a harsher attitude and policy towards the Indians than ever before. More support from white settlers. And that's the Indian Wars. We need to do the railroads, we need to do the homesteaders, we need to do the Battle of Little Bighorn and the consequences of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And then that is it. That's the Native Americans in the American West done, and we can move on to conflict and tension. Well done. Thank you for coming, as always. So, can I please